Thank you everybody for tuning into this video. My name is Ray Kruk. I am the Secretary of Life Tech. We are an organization dedicated to the discussion with a scientific angle on all pro-life topics that come from beginning of life to end of life and anything in between. So it covers a lot of ground and covers everything from science to apparently literary theory, which I think is considering how that shapes minds and shapes culture is a very important thing to take a look at. And I'm very honored and gratified at the moment to have Dr. Jeff Koloze here, who's going to give us a presentation. Could you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Uh, Salutations, everybody. I'm very happy to present my current research on literary theories that all English professors and other faculty use in colleges, community colleges, four-year colleges, universities, and even high schools now to help students appreciate literature. That's one reason why I titled this presentation Contemporary Literary Theories, Problems with Those Theories. I like to focus on that. And then why students of literature will benefit from what I call right-to-life literary theory. Students of literature, by the way, includes not only students, high school students, college students, but you and me, because we read fiction, we read novels, short stories, poems, we listen to rap music, we listen to trap music as well. So hopefully what I'll say about the contemporary literary theories dominant in academia will be helpful for all of us. I have my identifying info there. If you need to send me an email message about anything I've said, my personal email is drjeffkoloze@att.net. If you want to call me, I'm in the Cleveland, Ohio metropolitan area. My phone number 216-262-3511. I'd be happy to answer your questions, address your comments, especially to improve this paper for publication on lifeissues.net and maybe some other academic conferences where I want to present this research. The structure of this presentation is as follows. First, I want to review contemporary literary theories. Secondly, I'd like to focus on problems with those contemporary literary theories. Third, I want to address what exactly is right-to-life literary theory. The fourth section is subdivided into three aspects. I want to apply right-to-life literary theory to three literary works on the life issues. And the life issues I'll just categorize as abortion, infanticide, and euthanasia. Nicki Minaj's rap song, Autobiography, is really interesting as an example of abortion literature. Thomas Rydell's novel, The Hermit, can help us understand more about infanticide. And then the Family Guy TV series, Terry Schiavo episode on euthanasia, will be interesting for us to discuss as well. And whenever I give a presentation, whether it's for National Right to Life Committee's annual convention or academic conferences, my last item is also questions and answers or utterly hopeless deer in the headlight stares. I don't know everything. I'm only human. I'm learning as much as you are learning about different aspects of the Right to Life movement. So if there is a question that I cannot answer, I'll do my best to try to obtain information for you to satisfy yourself and me as well. As I said, I want to have this paper presented elsewhere, so I want to make it as perfect as possible. Right. This slide is a summary of some of the dominant contemporary literary theories. There are some literary theories that go by different nomenclature. For example, I remember distinctly being taught that there was such a thing as blackness studies and whiteness studies. That has probably since been subsumed under the critical race theory concept. But these names of the literary theories are the ones that you will find on the Purdue Online Writing Lab website. Purdue University has collated many of these literary theories, primary materials, secondary sources into a wonderful online site. I advise you to check that out. But I'll go in alphabetical order. Instead of creating a list in chronological order, I thought alphabetical might be easier to understand. First, what is literary theory? Well, a literary theory is a way to look at literature. It's like wearing different glasses. Sometimes we look at literature from this perspective, a feminist perspective, or a post colonial perspective, or a Marxist perspective. But the goal of any literary theory is to help us appreciate literature more, to dig into the literature, to extract the main idea of what the author wants to say. And hopefully, the literature will help improve our lives as well. That's an ancient Roman concept, by the way, that all literature should not only entertain us, but teach us something of value. And all these literary theories address those points to a degree. First, though, archetypal or Jungian criticism. Carl Jung was a famous psychoanalyst, Swiss, and he pronounced the name Jung, who came up with the idea of archetypes. These are symbols in our collective unconscious that we automatically respond to in a certain way. For example, colors. When we see the color white, we automatically think of purity and innocence. When we see the color red, we think of passion, romance, boredom, martyrdom, even. This is a Western idea, though. Some colors in different cultures mean different things, and the archetypes might be different. For example, in China, white is a color of evil. Red is a symbol of prosperity. There's a reason why it's called red china. But anyway, archetypes are useful. You might come across a novel on abortion, infanticide, euthanasia, which displays certain colors or talks about seasons in an archetypal way. Seasons are very interesting. If you're in the springtime of your life, you're young, you're just starting your life, and so forth. Then we go into the summertime of our lives. We get our jobs, we make a lot of money, get a house or two, raise a family, etc. Some of us are approaching the autumn of our lives. The hair gets grayer. We rely on our 401ks because we're retiring and so forth. And then the winter of our lives, that archetype is really symbolic, especially for euthanasia novels. If you're in the winter time of your life, things are colder. You know, you put an extra sweater on, like my 101-year-old Aunt Mary, who would have sweaters on in summer when it was 90 degrees. So colors are archetypes, symbols. Seasons are archetypes. Symbols like the cross, the crucifix, the Nazi swastika, those are archetypes also. So as you read different novels, short stories, poems, you might find as a pro-life reader certain archetypes dominant in that literature. Moving on. Biographical criticism. It should make obvious sense that if you're a reader, you want to know something about the author, him or herself. And biographical criticism is wonderful for us to know what went on in an author's life that he or she wrote the way he or she did. So when Gloria Swanson, for example, wrote her autobiography and talked about her abortions in the 1920s, it's good to know that about the famous film actor, Gloria Swanson, Sunset Boulevard fame, how those abortions affected her life. Critical disability studies is another contemporary literary theory. A wonderful theory because from the pro-life viewpoint, we know that persons who are not able-bodied, people who have disabilities, are still human beings worthy of respect. Critical disability studies helps all of us to see in literature people who may not have the most perfect bodies, the most perfect functions of the senses, are still human beings worthy of respect. I recently wrote a paper about critical disability studies from the right to life aspect. You might want to find it on my website and see how that contemporary theory can be used for pro-life purposes. Critical race theory, CRT. A lot of people are talking about critical race theory in the elementary schools and secondary schools. Well, it's been talked about in colleges for at least 20 or 30 years now. Maybe that is the predecessors are whiteness studies and blackness studies. The idea is that It's important to look at race, racial composition of a literary work, an author's life, and so forth. And it is important to know racial factors in literature. Are there instances where whites are oppressing African Americans? Are there instances where African Americans are oppressing whites? It's good to know that and to see how that can help us appreciate the literature more. Unfortunately, critical race theory has taken a much more segregationist approach now. You might find that in reading contemporary literature, the emphasis on race is paramount, much like, for example, in a feminist criticism coming up, the emphasis on gender is paramount. That's a possible problem. But moving on. Deconstruction is a critical theory that essentially argues the opposite of formalism, coming up soon. Deconstruction argues that words do not have an inherent stable meaning. The terms that we use are not stable, the meanings fluctuate over time. Think of the word mother. Motagr, mother, meant female parent for 2 millennia or more throughout all of human history. Now, birthing person is considered a better term to use instead of mother. How did that happen? Probably because some people argued that the word mother was so inherently unstable as a term and did not include persons who identified as female when they are biologically male, that a new phrase was constructed. When my students and I use deconstruction on poetry, for example, it's fun to play with the words. Jouissance is the French word. And sometimes you can have fun playing with the words to suggest that a word doesn't really mean what it means. That can be fun. Sometimes, though, that can be taken to extremes. And in the social environment, it has dire consequences. Feminist criticism is the next theory listed there. And the idea of feminist literary criticism is not the same as political feminism. If one is a feminist literary critic, one is looking for instances where women are either uh, oppressed by males, the word is patriarchy, or women need to connect with other women, and those are good things. There's even a component of feminist literary criticism that argues that women's writing is distinct from how men write. And there are some researchers like Deborah Tannen who talk about that as well. Pro-life activists have long known that you can be a pro-life feminist and argue for the rights of the unborn child as well as the mother. Some feminists who are pro-abortion don't understand that yet. They may not realize that the unborn woman is oppressed by patriarchy as much as born women. Formalism and new criticism. If you've ever gone to a high school or had a college class where the teacher, elementary school, high school teacher asked you, what does something mean? What does the poem mean? What does the short story mean? That person is using formalism. Formalism is a literary theory concerned with the unity of a written work, and it's focusing on the meanings of words. Words have stable meanings. When an author uses the word father, he or she means the male parent. Uh, Formalism also is credited with helping us understand the 4 steps of plot development. And we all know this as readers. When you read a mystery novel, for example, you want to know the first step of plot development, exposition. What is the problem being discussed? Well, there's a dead body. How did that body get there? Second step of plot development, the crisis or crises points between the protagonist and antagonist characters. You have a protagonist, not necessarily a hero, but a protagonist and an antagonist fighting, crisis points. Third step of plot development is climax. There's an essential conflict between the characters that leads inevitably to the fourth point, denouement or conclusion, where in the mystery novel, everything's wrapped up. In the last several pages, you find out who done it, why the person was murdered, and so forth. So formalism is a stable literary theory has been around for well over 100 years, of course, and it's helpful for us to understand literature. The next literary theory, gender criticism, gay and lesbian or queer studies. Queer studies, the word queer is perfectly acceptable to use to identify this literary theory. Well, if you consider if a woman can look at literature differently, feminist criticism, then maybe someone who has same sex attraction, a gay or lesbian person, would look at literature differently. There's also another aspect of gender criticism, the masculinist approach. It's very rare to find scholarly treatment of that. But if a woman looks at literature differently, a person with same sex attraction looks at literature differently, then a male would look at literature differently as well, which is probably why this category, gender criticism, tries to be all inclusive. I've completed a study of gay and lesbian literature on the right to life issues recently. You'll find that on my website. It's very interesting that some of that gay and lesbian literature is very close to supporting pro life ideas, respect for the individual, especially. Moving on, historical criticism. It makes sense. Scarlet Letter, written in 1850, is going to be a lot different than a romance novel written in the year 2021. It's good to know the historical circumstances of a literary work. Something written a century ago, different terminology, different concepts, different ideologies. And if you like history, you might like to delve more into the circumstances under which something was written, whether it's a pro life novel like God's Children by Stephen Friend in the early 80s, or a contemporary pro life fiction title. The top of the column, Marxist criticism. Just like with feminist literary criticism, you don't have to be a political feminist. You don't have to be a political Marxist to use Marxist literary criticism. You can still be Democrat, pro-life Democrat, Republican, independent, whatever. Marxist literary criticism involves economic factors in literature and the conflict of ideologies. So if you're a Marxist literary critic, you're looking for those aspects in literature. What economic factors would induce a young mother to consider abortion, or a couple to consider killing their handicapped newborn, or a family uh, contemplating euthanasia of an elderly relative? Economic factors are important for our pro-life issues. Uh, One other thing that pro-lifers can use regarding Marxist literary criticism is the idea of ideology. And that is, there was once a way that society controlled itself. In the 1950s, it was the dominant ideology that Negroes, not blacks, not African Americans, Negroes sat in the back of the bus. For that ideology, there was a counter ideology, a fight, saying no, African Americans, blacks can sit wherever they want to in the bus. With that competing conflict between ideologies, a new standard, a new ideology was created. We can see, we as pro-lifers can see, I think, that our dominant ideology now is that we have abortion legal throughout the 9 months of pregnancy for any reason whatsoever. There's a counter ideology to that the unborn child has as much right to live as the mother and the father. It's even more contentious. People are arguing for infanticide in the culture. Peter Singer is resident here in the United States now. He's advocating infanticide. We know the euthanasia ideology. We have a lot to argue against. Moral criticism, dramatic construction, is an ancient literary theory dating to Plato and Aristotle's time, the 4th century BC. You might find it very interesting to read the Purdue website's discussion of Plato's views on literature and Aristotle's views. New historicism, or cultural studies. If it's important to look at literature from a historical viewpoint, new historicism will tend to rewrite the past history. So, when I was a little kid, we celebrated Columbus Day. That was 50 years ago. Now, with new historicism, Columbus Day is probably known in academic circles as the, quote, European invasion of the Americas, close quote. When people look at Columbus Day today, they're revising what was taught 20, 30, 40 years ago. The historical fact of 1492 has been revised accordingly with a new sense of history, a new sense of ideology. I have a lot to say about post-colonial, post-structuralism, and structuralism momentarily. I'll jump ahead to psychoanalytic criticism. It is important to know what goes on in someone's mind, an author's mind when he or she writes something, the characters' minds when they talk in the written work of the song and so forth. Uh, Freud is crucially important in psychoanalytic theory. Unfortunately, over the years, my own experience with psychoanalytic criticism is that students will devolve the Freudian theories of repression, of sexual desires especially, into a study of literature. But it can be useful to identify phallic imagery in literature, or yonic imagery, to identify when characters are repressed, or when they misspeak and really manifest what they're really thinking. Reader response criticism is a relatively new theory from the early 20th century, and this theory gives readers great freedom. It used to be, and still might be in some classrooms, that when the faculty member talked about literature, whatever he or she said controlled. That was it. This is what the story means, that's it. Reader response criticism gives the reader competence to argue his or her case. So if you have a book on abortion, infanticide, euthanasia, and it's for abortion, or for infanticide, or for euthanasia, we as pro-life readers can use reader response criticism to argue, no, there's an alternative reading. There's a reading where the unborn child has as much right to live as his or her parents, or the handicapped newborn has as much right to live as his or her parents, or the elderly or medically vulnerable person has as much right to live as the other family members. There's an idea further in reader response criticism that readers should be competent. For example, I cannot argue that Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter is a novel about aliens coming to Earth and taking people to Mars. No, that would not be a competent reading. I have to be educated about things in the culture, educated about the history, educated about the author to make a valid opinion. Regarding structuralism, post-structuralism, I have to say I know of no colleague or ordinary person who ever consciously thinks of structuralist or post-structuralist principles when they look at literature. In fact, if you consider what the Purdue OWL site wrote about these theories, you'll find how irrelevant, if not difficult for ordinary readers, the theories might be. Quote, post-structuralism concerns itself with the ways and places where systems, frameworks, definitions, and certainties break down. Post-structuralism maintains that frameworks and systems are merely fictitious constructs and that they cannot be trusted to develop meaning or to give order. In fact, the very act of seeking order or a singular truth with a capital T is absurd because there exists no unified truth. I'll stop right there because if you are a religious person, Christian, Jewish, you know that there is definite truth. The post-structuralist philosophy might be interesting to consider as an alternative reading of certain works, especially on the life issues. It is philosophically, though, antithetical to what most of us believe. I think I should move on now. Problems with these contemporary literary theories were hinted at in my previous section, but I'll just very briefly go over them now. It's beneficial to use all these theories. It's good to use archetypes or to look at the author's biography, etc. However, human life is much more important than simply the symbols that we have in our lives, archetypal criticism. Human life is more important than our biographies or the able bodiedness of our bodies. Human life is more important than simply our race or our gender or the circumstances of our history or anything here. I've discovered over the past several years that these literary theories are helpful to read literary works, certainly, but there's something missing. And what's missing is the appreciation that these theories have for the essential point of literature. Literature exists for us human beings. We generate literature, we're entertained by it, and we can learn something from it. Literature is very pro life. That's why I've come up with Rights Life Literary Theory. And I first wrote about this in a paper in 2018. You might find some of my works on my website helpful to illustrate this further. But I think these 5 questions will be very important to bring to any literary work dealing with the right to life issues, certainly, but any aspect of literature. There's no particular order for these 5 questions, by the way. They can be adjusted. Some people might want to take the fifth question first. That's perfectly fine. I think that the ordering I have here, though, goes from an abstract to a very specific level. First question of Rights Life Literary Theory. Does the literary work support the perspective that human life is, in the philosophical sense, a good, something which is priceless? Hopefully, the work will say human life is a good thing, yes, but even if the literary work does not indicate that human life is good, we can still learn from that. Second question. Does the literary work respect the individual as a being with inherent rights, the paramount one being the right to life? 3. If the literary work covers the actions of a family, does it do so respecting heterosexual normativity and the integrity of the family? Now, does this question preclude that anybody with same sex attraction or gay or lesbian activists should abandon rights life literary theory? No. I argue no, because heterosexual normativity is the foundation of human life. That's how we get here, test tubes notwithstanding. Fourth question. Does the literary work comport with the view that unborn, newborn, and mature human life has an inherent right to exist? Now, this fourth question would be most obvious to entertain when looking at novels, short stories, poems, rap songs, which concern abortion, infanticide, and euthanasia. Final question. When they are faced with their mortality, do the characters come to a realization that there is a divine presence in the world which justifies a life-affirming perspective? I've tried to make this question as broad as possible to incorporate, for example, works by the South Korean author Park Wan-so, writing in South Korean culture, versus an American who might be writing from a Jewish, a Christian, or a Muslim perspective. So I hope that these 5 questions will help all of us appreciate the literature that we read and that we critique better. And to begin the illustrations, here's an image of Nicki Minaj. It's clip art. I hope that the audience knows who Nicki Minaj is. If you listen to her rap works, you know her. If you follow her on Twitter and the various tweet fests that she has, wonderful. I did a study of biography and the rights life issues recently. That the paper's on my website also. And I discovered that people like Patricia Neal, Gloria Swanson, Nicki Minaj would often write about their abortions. And Nicki Minaj's song Autobiography has a significant component dealing with her abortion. That's coming up right now. These lyrics were translated from the song itself. There's a works site at the very end. Capitalization and homophonic errors have been modified, but I tried to keep the original language. I'll read through this section of her song. Please, baby, forgive me. Mommy was young. Mommy was too busy trying to have fun. Now I pat myself in the back for sending you back, because God knows I was better than that to conceive you and leave you. The concept alone seems evil. I'm trapped in my conscience. I adhere to the nonsense, listen to people who told me I wasn't ready for you, but how would they know what I was ready to do? And of course, it wasn't your fault. It's like I feel you in the air. I hear you saying, Mommy, don't cry. Can't you see I'm right here? I gotta let you know what you mean to me. When I'm sleeping, I see you in my dreams with me. Wish I could touch your little face or just hold your little hand. If it's part of God's plan, maybe we can meet again. I read this purposely fast because in the song itself, the lyrics are rushed together. There is no internal punctuation on the various websites that transcribe the lyrics, and you can probably pick up the beat and the rhyming scheme inherent in the song as well. I think this feature of rap indicates several things that are important for us pro lifers to understand. The flow of words, the constant flow of words, the rush of words indicates probably the great anxiety that mothers have when they have suffered through an abortion. But looking at this excerpt from the song Autobiography, I'd like to look at the 5 questions of right side literary theory, give some commentary on them. First question: does this literary work support the perspective that human life is a good thing? And I argue, looking at this excerpt, that it is good. Nicki Minaj, or her persona, uh, singing this song, must admit that its life is good because she wants the child to be with her. Think of that. If life were not good, why would you want someone to be with you in that horrible existence? So, on the first question of right life literary theory, I can say yes, this work does indicate that human life is a good thing. Second question: does the literary work respect the individual as a being with inherent rights? The paramount one being the right to life. And one can argue yes. Fortunately, though, to appreciate how this song does illustrate that individuals have the right to life, you'd have to read the rest of the song as well. This is a problem of formalist criticism. You often cannot take an excerpt from a larger work and just make grand claims about it. You have to read within context. And I hope that you will eventually. The third question of right to life literary theory: if the literary work covers the actions of family, does it do so respecting heterosexual normativity and the integrity of the family? And I'd have to indicate one thing. The persona, Nicki Minaj, identifies herself as mommy, not mother, but mommy, a very affectionate term. She identifies the child, yeah? Uh, but where's the father? The father is absent. And a new historicist critic, a Marxist critic, could supplement this question by talking about the dire straits of the African American family, by the way. Uh, when Lorraine Hansberry wrote A Raisin in the Sun in 1959, the African American family was on track to be a fully integrated family, mother and father, kids, aiming for home ownership. Something happened in the 60s and early 70s where the African American family fell apart. And we experience to this day in 2021 the fact that most African American families are matriarchal, dad is absent. Dad is not here to help this young woman, the mommy in this excerpt, or the child. That's very unfortunate. Fourth question of right to life literary theory: does the literary work comport with the view that unborn, newborn, mature human life has an inherent right to exist? Even though the mommy character in the song is addressing the child, the child's obviously aborted, obviously gone from the scene, he or she is still being addressed by mommy. I think that does indicate that this song suggests that unborn human life has an inherent right to exist. The final question of right to life literary theory: when they are faced with their mortality, do characters come to a realization there's a divine presence in the world? One cannot say too much about this because it is an excerpt from a longer poem. And really, to answer this question about the divine presence in the world, you'd have to look at Minaj's whole oeuvre, and she's written numerous songs, wonderful songs. But this excerpt does mention God's plan, and that indicates to me that the mommy character is aware of something, some divine presence. She mentions God specifically, not a phrase like divine being or, quote, the man upstairs, something innocuous and flaccid like that. This character, mommy, identifies God's plan. So maybe the mommy character is keenly aware of God's plan in her life and the child's life, and maybe further, she knows how she's kind of eluded that plan. Those are just some brief comments I would make applying the 5 questions of right-side literary theory to Nicki Minaj's song Autobiography. Now, moving on. This is an excerpt from Thomas Rideau's novel The Hermit, 2016. This passage is on page 51. The novel concerns a newborn child who is found murdered, and the plot of the novel involves solving this mystery of who's responsible for the child's murder. What if the mom and dad left the country? We've searched all departures. No one has arrived with the child and left without one. The absolute worst part is the autopsy report. Bernal walks over to the photograph of the boy. He points at the region around his eyes, the blackened area. Lorenzo estimated that the boy was starved to death 2 to 3 days before the car was abandoned on the beach, before ... before they left him in a cardboard box. The autopsy report also determined that he was around 12 weeks old. When we found him, we all thought he was a newborn because he was so thin and tiny. We've called all the delivery rooms and doctors on the island, and all young mothers with boys ranging from 1 month old to 5 months. 187 mothers in all. All the babies were accounted for. We've spoken with a number of fathers, too. We got a few leads, but nothing that took us anywhere. Erhard can't look at the photograph anymore. How can someone abandon a child? He says. Bernal looks even more tired now. In the end, we had to bury him yesterday morning, east of Morro Hable, Playa del Matoral. Bobcat dug a hole the size of a microwave oven. We did it quickly to avoid media attention. We were afraid journalists would come out and see the small coffin. Do you know how creepy that is? I thought of my own 3-year-old boy. There's something all wrong about burying children that small. There are many more infanticide excerpts I could have used for this presentation, some extremely graphic, but this is a contemporary work that I recently did a book review for, posted on Amazon, I think before Amazon disavowed all of my book reviews. This review of Rideau's novel is on my website and other sources like lifeissues.net as well. Let's look at this excerpt from the 5 questions of right-life literary theory. Does this literary work support the perspective that human life is, in the philosophical sense, a good? Well, it's interesting that the people in this passage, the inspector, the hero character, are down and sad that the child is dead. That's noteworthy in today's culture, and that it just should not be that way. The characters know that a newborn child should not be found in a cardboard box on a beach, abandoned. So I think to answer the first question, yes, this novel does suggest that human life is a priceless thing. Second, does the literary work respect the individual as a being with inherent rights? I think it is obvious. I'll move on to question 3. If the literary work covers the actions of a family, does it do so respecting heterosexual normativity? And it's very interesting that the various characters are concerned that where are the mother and father, the mom and dad? You can tell that this is a British translation, a British English translation. Where are the mother and father? Why aren't they caring for their newborn boy? Not child, but specifically a boy. Yeah. The 4th question of right-side literary theory. Does the literary work comport with the view that unborn, newborn, and mature human life has an inherent right to exist? This question is obviously answered in the affirmative, and the great care that the characters show in displaying their emotions indicate how serious this matter is and how sad they are. I'd also like to say something touching on gender criticism, especially the masculinist approach. I think it's a truism that women are able to show their emotions much uh, easier than men. Uh, if this is sexist, um, I think it's true. Women can cry more. Men tend to hold it in. Men don't cry, supposedly. When men do get angry and want to show their sadness, they might transfer that sadness into anger or vulgar language, which is probably why the one character talked about a certain bobcat excavator the way he did. And if you consider having this large machine excavate only a small size for a coffin the size of a microwave oven, that image is so jarring. You know what is going into that small grave, the body of a baby boy. Very sad. The fifth question of right to life literary theory. When they are faced with their mortality, do the characters come to realization there's a divine presence in the world? Once again, this is just one page of a novel that's over 400 pages long. You'd have to read the entire novel to understand the religious aspects of the characters in the novels, most of whom are irreligious, but they identify with certain religious concepts. But one thing's very interesting, the fact that the last line reads, "There's something all wrong about burying children that small." That line suggests that the character knows that there's something right about having a child live. And if the character knows what's wrong rather, all wrong about burying children so small, he must know what's right. Maybe he is aware of religious concepts or basic ethical principles. Let's move on. The next three slides will highlight, and I'll read through the passage, the excerpt from Family Guy's Terry Schiavo episode. This is the first portion of a rather sing-songy episode. I discussed this in a paper I gave before the National Right to Life Committee recently about comedy and abortion and the life issues, and how some things cannot be comedic. There's nothing funny about abortion, infanticide, or euthanasia. And I used the Terry Schiavo episode on Family Guy as an example of that. The way this slide and subsequent slides are written, they're child characters who are saying one thing. Uh, the doctors are suggested as well. I'll read through just the various words that the characters utter, though. Michael Schiavo character, the doctor, and so forth. "Hi, doctor, it's me, Michael Schiavo. How's my wife doing?" "She's a vegetable." "I hate vegetables." And the characters then laugh. "Don't worry about her, Mr. Schiavo. She's being kept alive by medical science." "Gee, look at all this stuff. How does it all work?" "Well, I'll tell you." And at this point in the Terry Schiavo episode, the conversation goes from pure dialogue to sing-songy. "This one keeps her liver clean. This one checks her pee. How about this one over here? Oh, that's just the TV." And the chorus of children laugh. This slide continues that conversation. "This one checks her heart rate. This one checks her veins. And this dispenses gravy for her mashed potato brains. Oh, 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 Terry Schiavo is kind of a live-o. What a lively little bugger. Maybe we should just unplug her. Terry Schiavo is kind of a live-o, most expensive plant you'll ever see." I've excised certain sections. Continuing, "There's only one solution. It's in the Constitution. We've got to pull the plug." The source is Terry Schiavo, the musical. The full reference will be on the works cited page. I've collapsed the Terry Schiavo episode, all the dialogue on this one slide to make it easier to review the 5 questions of right to life literary theory and provide my commentary. First question of the theory: does the literary work support the perspective that human life is, in the philosophical sense, a good thing? No. In fact, it seems as though the characters are arguing that vegetables have more right than human beings, and the audience perceiving that idea should be shocked at that realization. Secondly, does the literary work respect the individual as a being with inherent rights, the paramount one being the right to life? I think the answer to that is obvious. Maybe the character of Michael Schiavo thinks that he has an inherent right to life, but not his wife, Terry Schiavo. Third, if the literary work covers the actions of a family, does it do so respecting heterosexual normativity and the integrity of the family? It's very interesting. We don't have Terry Schiavo talking in this excerpt. People are talking about her, the doctors, people who are professional, who should know what they're saying. Michael Schiavo, who is Terry Schiavo's husband, and I don't know. I think a husband should care for his wife and defend her. And here, this husband, the character of Michael Schiavo, is not defending her. That says a lot about Michael Schiavo more than Terry Schiavo. The fourth question of rights-led literary theory: does the literary work comport with the view that unborn, newborn, and mature human life has an inherent right to exist? The answer there is obviously not. In fact, you can argue, looking at these two columns, that maybe the characters value plants and vegetables more than a human being. There's something terribly unfunny about this, even though the chorus in this episode tries to make fun of it and tries to laugh. Finally, when they are faced with their mortality, do the characters come to realization of the divine presence in the world? There's just one commentary to make here. God is not referenced. There is no religious principle referenced. Michael Schiavo defers to the doctor, and that is especially damning because doctors are inherently pro-life and life-affirming. They want to maintain life, protect it. This doctor character does not want to protect the life of Terry Schiavo. In fact, it is interesting that God is supplanted by another authority, the Constitution. Michael Schiavo is mistakenly claiming that the Constitution offers a solution of, quote, pulling the plug. That is nowhere in the US Constitution. So the person watching this episode, reading his words, if the person is a competent pro-life reader, would realize that there's a major discrepancy here. Those are just some brief comments about this. This slide indicates the works cited. The three sources I've used thus far for this paper presentation: the Nicki Minaj video can be watched at that link, the URL. If you're interested in reading Thomas Rydell's novel, there's a publication info. And then if you want to watch the Terry Schiavo musical on Family Guide, the URL for that wiki is provided. I have enjoyed constructing this PowerPoint. I'm enjoying perfecting the paper which will accompany this presentation and which should be uploaded to my website soon and on the LifeTech website hopefully soon. If you have questions or comments, please feel free to email me, drjeffkoloze@att.net. I will gladly reply to you as quickly as possible. I mentioned my phone number on the title page. I'll give it again here, 216-262-3511. And if you're interested, please consult book reviews and papers I put on my website, drjeffkoloze.com. Hopefully the book reviews especially will help you in writing book reviews to upload to Amazon or Goodreads.com or your local newspapers or pro-life publications. Thank you for your time.
count down to 3, 2, 1. Hello,
Tyler,
everybody.
please.
And here we go. We're going to talk over each other to start off
I'm
with.
sorry.
I think we
Okay.
should leave that in. We should totally leave that in.
Okay.